Karen Trimble Alliaume is Associate Professor of Theology and Co-Director of the Women's Studies Program at Lewis University in Illinois. She received her doctorate in Theology and Ethics from Duke University in 1999, where she pursued feminist and other liberation theologies of the United States and the developing world. The project she's going to be talking about today is her second book-length project. Her first, which is very near completion, is Reassembling Christ, Feminist Christology, Identity Politics, and the Imagination of Christian Communities. And she will speak to us today about her new work in progress. Karen.
Thanks, Anne. Welcome, everybody. Happy St. Patrick's Day. There are a few green iced cupcakes, I believe, in the back in case you're missing the St. Patty's Day lunch. The title of my project, as you can see, is, or at least of the small piece of it I'm going to talk about today, is Hooked on a Feeling, Romance, Sexual Pleasure, and the Theology of the Body. And so to begin, first of all, with that concept, hooked on a feeling, I want to begin with a personal story. During my first year in college, my friend and dorm mate Kathy approached me with this kind of sheepish look on her face. She had been reading a romance novel, and it was giving her a strange, tingly feeling. She didn't know exactly what this feeling was or how to deal with it. Her reading was at once pleasurable and disturbing because this pleasure seemed beyond her control. From my position as an experienced romance reader, I tried to reassure her that these feelings were indeed normal, quote unquote, right? Though I was a bit embarrassed and hesitant about doing so. Perhaps this was because I was recalling the last time I had had an awkward sex talk with another relatively uninformed woman who was close to me, my mother. More on this shortly. Okay, I had started reading serious romance novels in high school when I was working at my first job at the local library. I was a very slow reshelver because I spent more time reading the books than putting them back on the shelves. And I checked a lot of them out myself, including Harlequin series romances from the early 70s that looked a lot like this. And they had titles like this, too, The Velvet Glove. I enjoyed them, although I remember being troubled at the time, not by the sexual feelings they aroused, so Kathy's problem, for whatever reason, was not mine, but what I thought of as the hero's meanness. They tended to be older men who suspected the young, innocent heroines of cheating on them, of trying to, pull the wool over their eyes, and punished them accordingly, usually through sexual teasing. While these stories were never, at least in this series, very sexually explicit, they did expend a lot of descriptive effort on the heroine's reactions, both emotional and physical, to the hero's advances. My interest in this genre gradually waned, replaced by other types of reading, but my interest in romance as a genre was rekindled when I took a graduate course with Janice Radway, whose 1984 book, Reading the Romance, Women, Patriarchy, and Popular Literature, was reprinted in 1991, the year I started graduate school. So back briefly to my mother. She often asked me when I worked at the library to bring back biographies for her. That was her favorite genre. One night, as I was rushing to get home, I grabbed, without really looking very closely at it, a paperback from the biography rack by Linda Lovelace called Ordeal. No one in this room is old enough besides me, other than, well, a few of you might, see where this is going. Okay, it looked from the cover and from the blurb on the back that I again just glanced at like a formulaic but true story of a woman who overcomes obstacles to eventually find happiness. My mother was horrified, and so was I, to find out that what I checked out for her was the life story of the star of the porn film Deep Throat. The most excruciating part of the ensuing conversation was when my mom approached me with much the same look on her face that Kathy had later and asked me what fellatio was. And what really kind of, disturbs me, makes me wonder in retrospect, is that I knew the answer. So, from reading, by the way, okay. In case you haven't already figured this out, my college friend Kathy was Catholic, born and raised, but then so was I, so quite obviously was my mother. But Kathy's and my somewhat similar suburban upbringing in the 70s and early 80s, born and educated post-Vatican II by parents born at the end of the 20s, so our parents were not baby boomers. This might account for some of the similarities in Kathy's and my experiences, that sex talk was something outside family and pretty much outside church, that knowledge had to be gained elsewhere in our cases through reading and talking to one another. But what accounts for our differences? How did romance novels become, at least for me, and perhaps later for Kathy, one piece of a kind of ad hoc sex ed program that at the time seemed to bear no relation to Catholic faith? If others in my generation, at the tail end of the baby boomers or on the cusp of Generation X, kind of right in the middle there, could sum up what we knew from what our families and church taught about sex to say premarital sex and birth control are mortal sins and not much else, might this begin to account for why the Catholic sex talk of John Paul II's 20th century teachings on the theology of the body are hailed, especially among some younger Catholics, as a refreshing, perhaps even revolutionary, positive reassessment of sex? In order to explore this appeal further, I want to examine John Paul's theology of the body through one of its popularizations, Christopher West's Theology of the Body for Beginners, which I argue utilizes a rhetoric of romance to reach its putative audience. I will also take a brief look, comparative look, at a representative revisionist thinker, Catholic feminist ethicist Christine Gudorf, whose work Body, Sex, and Pleasure offers a far-reaching constructive rethinking of traditional Catholic and more broadly Christian sexual norms. It's interesting, I think, to put these two next to each other because on their face they seem to represent completely opposite poles of intra-Catholic controversy on sexual ethics. West, following John Paul II, asserts that the norm for sexual morality is whether or not a given behavior truly images or signifies the free, total, faithful, fruitful love of Christ. If it does not, it is a counterfeit for the love we truly desire. West's language of counterfeit points to some of the perhaps startling similarities between his and Gudorf's work, a conviction that sexual ignorance is bad, and recommendations for how to get what we truly want, in fact, how to know what that actually is in the first place. They also share a conviction about how sex and sexuality, rightly understood, contribute to the common good and display the inherent sociality of human beings, so they construe that claim in very different ways. And finally, each recognizes that traditional sexual education, whether the minimal just the facts versions offered by public school systems afraid of parental pressure, or the abstinence-only version offered by both religious and secular institutions, is ineffective because it does not relate to the experiences and needs of its audience. If, as Talal Asad put it, the inability to be in communion with God is a function of untaught bodies, then both Gudorf's work and West's popularization of the late Pope's theology of the body aim to remedy that pedagogical deficiency. Both reclaim sex and sexual pleasure as powerful in a discourse of overcoming repression. Pleasure, but it needs to be the right kind of pleasure, is proffered by each as empowering women to take up roles necessary and crucial to the health of the society as well as to the good of their souls. So let's take a look at the popular reception of John Paul II's teachings on marriage and sexuality delivered early in his pontificate between 1979 and 1984 and first published in 1997 as Theology of the Body, Human Love in the Divine Plan. I have a long quote here that I'll just leave up so you have time to kind of read through it. The Theology of the Body unpacks John Paul's controlling metaphor, the spousal meaning of the body, in order to flesh out and develop in full color the photographic negatives of the Catholic magisterium's teachings on premarital sex, birth control, and homosexuality. John Paul defines the spousal meaning of the human body as follows, and I'll just read the quote here. The human body with its sex, its masculinity and femininity, seen in the very mystery of creation, is not only a source of fruitfulness and of procreation, as in the whole natural order, but contains from the beginning the spousal attribute, that is, the power to express love, precisely that love in which the human person becomes a gift, and through this gift fulfills the very meaning of his being and existence. The Yahwist narrative, and in particular Genesis 2:25, allows us to deduce that man, as male and female, enters the world precisely with this consciousness of the meaning of his own body, of his masculinity and femininity. I find the non-inclusive language here actually pretty interesting, but that's maybe another piece that didn't make it into this paper today. He elaborates this spousal meaning of the body, particularly through his readings of the second chapter of Genesis. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and the two of them become one body, as well as the fifth chapter of Ephesians, which contains the infamous advice that wives should submit to their husbands as to the Lord. John Paul is often applauded for interpreting this latter admonition to submit as urging the mutuality of spousal submission. Husbands and wives are to love one another. Nevertheless, for him, as well as for his successor, Pope Benedict XVI, the fact that women's and men's equal dignity as persons is still understood as physical, psychological, and ontological complementarity between men and women undoes the egalitarian impulse of this recommended mutuality. Feminist theologians and theorists have long argued that this complementary understanding of sexual difference, in which men and women embody human nature in two contrasting ways that are nonetheless to be equally valued, has always historically and practically translated into inequality for women. In his 1988 letter on the dignity of women, John Paul II defines the dignity and vocation of women as those who receive love in order to love in return. Woman, he says, can only find herself by giving love to others. This rhetoric, reinforcing the identification of women with both a greater capacity for and responsibility for nurturing relationship, resonates with the typical happy ending of almost any given romance novel. For example, I quote here the last two lines of Elizabeth Lowell's Chain Lightning, one of my personal favorites, by the way. Okay. Even as he gathered her into his arms, she came to him, holding him. They slept as they would always live, body to body, breath to breath, love to love, complete. You can insert your own favorite example here. I could have used, the Jerry Maguire movie, for instance, You Complete Me, that kind of idea. This juxtaposition of John Paul's rhetoric and of the romance novel also highlights one of the common criticisms of the theology of the body, that it romanticizes sexual love and marriage too much, maintaining that each and every act of sexual intercourse must embody not only procreative but unitive intent. More than one married female Catholic ethicist, including people like Christina Traina, Christine Gudorf, just to give a few examples, have questioned this norm from within the context of the messier reality of actual lived marriage. While Catholic theologian David Cloutier agrees that the theology of the body is not enough engaged with this messiness as well, he locates the rhetorical appeal of the theology of the body in its ability to utilize contemporary culture's emphasis on experience and authenticity as the final arbiters of the goodness of sexual behavior. What romantic or sexual experiences then, especially for young adults, contextualize and condition their hearing of the message of the theology of the body? Cloutier suggests, based on his own limited and anecdotal experience with his students, that current college-age young adults and their parents' generation are in general asking quite different questions about sex and sexuality. And I've found his observations to be borne out by my own limited and anecdotal experience with students as well. While revisionist ethicists of the baby boomer generation, he uses Joan Timmerman's work as an example, as kind of a foil here, but we might as easily use Christine Gudorf, who I'll talk about later, or Margaret Farley, or any number of feminist ethicists of this generation. While they address an audience feeling suffocated by the traditional teachings, the theology of the body addresses a younger audience feeling overwhelmed and exhausted by sexual freedom and choice. It's the argument he's making, and I find it fairly compelling. In other words, perhaps the most hospitable audience for the theology of the body consists of those for whom the previous generation's sexual revolution succeeded all too well, turning their social lives into a cultural dictatorship. Donna Freitas' research in her recent book, Sex and the Soul, Juggling Sexuality, Spirituality, Romance, and Religion on America's College Campuses, confirms these observations, surfacing the dissatisfaction that many college students feel with their campus's hookup culture. She finds that all these options, all this freedom, simply add to the confusion for many students. Freitas also finds a disconnect between the religious and sexual attitudes of many students. Rather than finding a divide between the sexual and religious attitudes and behaviors of students at religiously affiliated versus non-religious schools, Freitas notes that the big difference lies between students at evangelical schools and all the other students, including those at Catholic schools, with some small exception. She finds Catholic students are much more like their peers at other institutions than like their evangelical peers. Common experiences for students at both types of schools, however, Freitas found, was that they were highly invested in religious and/or spiritual identities, that they experienced sexual desire and longed to act on it, that romance and experiencing fulfilling romantic relationships were priorities for them, and that students didn't know how to reconcile those three desires. Women and men alike at both types of schools tended to disassociate romance from sexual intimacy. Rather, the number one romantic experience among the students Freitas interviewed was just talking for hours. Romance to them was chaste. And I thought this was kind of a popular example of that, if anyone's read this book or seen the movie. The unconsummated vampire-human romance seems quite popular. I have questions about why, but again, that's maybe part of a further project. To further investigate how the rhetoric of romance in the theology of the body addresses this particular audience, the one described by Freitas, for instance, I want to take a look back then at the romance novels I was reading in high school. Series romances of the 70s and early 80s, like those I read as a teenager, generally followed a formula in which the heroine is seemingly inexplicably attracted to a hero whose most salient characteristic is his contempt for women. In her 1992 book, Loving with a Vengeance, Mass-Produced Fantasies for Women, feminist literary theorist Tanya Modleski describes the formula as follows. A young, inexperienced, poor to moderately well-to-do woman becomes involved with a handsome, strong, experienced, older, wealthy man, older than her by about 10 to 15 years. The heroine is confused by the hero's behavior since, though he is obviously interested in her, he is mocking, cynical, contemptuous, hostile, and even somewhat brutal. By the end, however, all misunderstandings are cleared away, and the hero reveals his love for the heroine, who reciprocates. Unlike some feminist critics who denounced the success of formula romances as a backlash against feminist progress, re-indoctrinating women into patriarchal marriage and motherhood through quote-unquote soft porn fantasy, it's Ann Douglas, Modleski was willing to acknowledge in her work more complexity in women's responses to romance. She explored the possibility that romances, while serving to keep women in their place, still critical, may at the same time be concerned with real female problems. And she examined them for the varied and complex strategies women use to adapt to circumscribed lives and to convince themselves that limitations are really opportunities. She found that the appeal of the rigid formula of the Harlequin romance circled around the double drama of mistaken identity. The heroine is often initially mistaken by the hero for yet another of the scheming adventuresses or other women, which serve as foils for the heroine's true innocence, while the hero's brutality must eventually be explained as his resistance to his growing love for her. Things, therefore, are not as they seem. By the end, brutal men are revealed as tender lovers, while naive and confused heroines are shown to be incredibly sexy and alluring precisely because they are innocent and therefore virtuous. In fact, the heroine's ignorance of her own attractiveness is key to the successful resolution of the romance. The only way the heroine can achieve her goals, a husband, economic comfort, is by appearing not to want them. The reader, who knows how things are going to turn out, is not able to share the heroine's ignorance, or consequently, I think, her virtue. Modleski posited that these series romance novels inoculated their readers against the major evils of sexist society by reassuring them that although some men are actually brutal, much masculine meanness can be interpreted as the overflow of their love or the measure of their resistance to our extraordinary charms. In other words, heterosexual romance is portrayed as, on the surface, often hurtful and confusing, but underneath, fulfilling and satisfying. A discourse of hidden truth, couched as dramatic irony, where the reader knows what the protagonist does not, propels the appeal of the formulaic romance, and, as I shall now argue, the appeal of the theology of the body as well. I argue that John Paul's theology of the body may be appealing and effective where it is appealing and effective, in great part because its popularizers, like Christopher West, advocate the magisterium's complementary understanding of sexual difference, using popular cultural romance conventions to heighten its persuasive power. For those who aren't familiar with him, West is basically a one-man industry based on the theology of the body. He has written, I want to say, at least 6 books on it, lots of study materials, CDs. If you go to his website, he lectures widely. So he's one of the main reasons, I think, that the theology of the body has gotten disseminated as far as it has. So more specifically, I think the romantic appeal of West's work is created by 2 rhetorical moves, which I'm calling respectively, Mystery is Not Mysterious and The Pope Rocks. So I'll talk about those in turn. Okay, here's his website, so you can take a look for yourself. As Christopher West's website puts it, discover the quote-unquote hidden talks of John Paul II's theology of the body. West explains in his 2004 manual, Theology of the Body for Beginners, it's not for dummies, luckily, okay, that in the Christian sense, mystery does not refer to some unsolvable puzzle. It refers to the innermost reality of God and to his eternal plan for humanity. Sexual difference then becomes the key to solving this puzzle, and Pope John Paul II provides it. God wants to marry us, says West. And God wants this eternal marital plan to be so obvious that God imprinted it in our flesh as male and female. The romance begins, of course, in the Garden of Eden. The 2nd chapter of Genesis is read by John Paul II and by West as the story of a man, Adam, looking for love, who finally finds it in Eve, bone of his bone, flesh of his flesh. Adam is depicted as expressing absolute wonder and fascination upon beholding Eve's body, a body which fully expresses her personhood. This experience of unity, writes West, overcomes the man's solitude in the sense of being alone without the other, and not only sexual union, but spiritual union is the result. A rhetoric of authenticity also heightens this romantic appeal to the audience, who can read back into their own, perhaps failed, sexual relationships, a divine spark that just didn't flame. West explicitly encourages this retrospective recognition of true as opposed to false desire or lust. Behind every sin, he writes, behind every disordered acting out, there's a genuine human desire that's meant to be fulfilled through Christ and the church. As our desires become untwisted, we begin to realize that we really desire eternal love and joy. If you're looking for the meaning of life, writes West, it's impressed right in your body, in your sexuality. The purpose of life is to love as God loves, and this is what your body, as a man or woman, calls you to. Or again, a man's body doesn't make sense by itself, nor does a woman's body. Or finally, this is what the body teaches us. We're destined for love. Like the innocent and naive heroine of the 70s Harlequin romance, we all need to figure out what our bodies are telling us, according to West. Our minds need to catch up with and make sense of the compelling heterosexual imperative that apparently points the way, not only to marriage and family, but to the consummation of God's romance with us in heaven. The rhetoric of obvious yet hidden difference between men and women, stamped into our bodies by God, but maybe not able to be unproblematically read from those bodies without the intervention of the Pope or of West, reinforces a naturalized, common sense understanding of sexual difference, while at the same time proffering the discovery or rediscovery of this difference as revelatory. This is why I think the quotations marks around hidden actually make sense. It produces a sense of conspiratorial glee, of being in on a secret, of spiritual adventure cobbled out of the stuff of everyday life and relationships. West uses not only marital, but martial rhetoric to support this sense of purposeful adventure. Once you know the secret, you are conscripted into a spiritual army. Your heterosexual marriage is not just a personal choice, not just obedience to God's plan, but is at the same time a taking sides against an enemy. In our sex-saturated culture, says West, no battlefield is too small when one contracepted union changes the world forever, he says. Why? Because, West writes, sex isn't just about sex. The way we understand and express our sexuality points to our deepest held convictions about who we are, who God is, the meaning of love, the ordering of society, and even the ordering of the universe. Further helping to foster this sense of enlistment into a cosmic cause is a romantic reversal of expectation brought on, like the happy ending of the romance novel, by his declaration of his loving desire to marry you. You thought he hated you? He really loves you. You thought he just wanted your body? Your body expresses your person, and he wants all of you. You thought the church didn't like bodies? The church loves bodies. West writes, Christianity says the body is so good you can't even fathom it. Knowing the ending ahead of time, as for Christians destined for heavenly contemplation of God, or for romance readers expecting the requisite happy ending, allows for the proper decoding or recoding of desire. The mystery that is revealed finally by John Paul and by West is how to discern real from inauthentic love and sex when you can't figure it out from your feelings alone. While contemporary U.S. culture seems to make sex all important, the saturation of culture with sex actually serves to devalue it, West argues. Real sex is that expressed between married, heterosexual, monogamous spouses, in which every sexual act is open to conception. I actually have a typo here that says to contraception, which is an interesting typo. Okay. This is the sex that expresses who you really are, even if you don't know it. So there's a kind of accusation of false consciousness operating here, what I might want to even call anonymous heterosexuality, if anybody knows Karl Rahner at all. Okay. And it's seductive, perhaps, because it also hastens to affirm the pleasures of even the wrong kind of sex. To live a sexually pure life, whether married or celibate, is to revert to Eden as well as to experience a foretaste of heaven in West's rhetoric. If we really knew who we were and what was good for us, we would behave differently. Try telling that to my 5-year-old. And we would live happily ever after. True love cares about the other and about the other's pleasure. So we need to move on to why the Pope rocks now. And to do that, I want to return a little bit to some of the feminist theory on romance that I've started to explore. Formula romances like those discussed by Medleski and that I was reading in high school have changed actually quite a bit, I think, since the 70s, due in large part to the feedback and relationships developed among romance authors and readers and publishers. For many series and titles, heroines have become more independent, women have become as active as men, and many romances share point of view between the hero and the heroine. So not only do we get to look at the heroine trying to figure out her feelings, we sometimes get to see the male hero figuring that out as well. Janice Radway has characterized these shifts as a struggle by the writers and readers of the genre to fashion a feminist subject position for white middle-class women who want to combine serious relationships and family life with successful careers. Her influential 1984 study of a group of romance readers reading the romance looked at a group of just such women, middle-class white homemakers in one Midwestern town. These women were not Harlequin readers. They preferred historical romances, which typically include more explicit sex than the Harlequins do, and also tend to portray more independent and defiant heroines. They read religiously, Radway says, and they didn't like to be interrupted before finishing a book because the emotional gratification of the narrative's resolution was important to them. Radway was surprised, in fact, that it was the act of romance reading itself, creating, quote, a time or space within which a woman can be entirely on her own, preoccupied with her personal needs, desires, and pleasures, that accounted for her informant's pleasure in and loyalty to romance reading. Why romances in particular, though, she asked? Couldn't the need for alone time have been met for these women through other reading or activities? Radway found that romance was important to these women because it raised their spirits, involving the reader vicariously in the gradual evolution of a loving relationship whose culmination she is later permitted to enjoy through a description of the heroine's and hero's life together after their necessary union. The readers were not drawn to descriptions of sexual encounters so much as to the reinterpretation of misunderstood actions and in the declarations of mutual love. Radway found that the readers wished to participate in the gradual growth of love and trust, and to witness the way in which the heroine is eventually cared for by a man who also confesses that he needs her. These preferences also hint, Radway concludes, at the existence of an equally powerful wish to see a man dependent upon a woman. We might read this as women readers' embrace, at least in fantasy, of the mutual marital submission recommended by John Paul. We might at the same time suspect that this situation of a man's dependence upon a woman is not so fantastical after all. It's not terribly foreign from our culture's tendency to make women responsible for relationships. So it doesn't really surprise me that a man might be seen as dependent on a woman for that aspect of his life. What might be more novel in the novels is the portrayal of the man as the nurturing figure. For this group of women, an ideal romance novel was one in which the hero's ministrations to the heroine were linked analogously, either by the narrator or by the heroine's speeches herself in the book, to maternal nurturance. Radway found that romance reading addressed needs, desires, and wishes that a male partner could not for these women. But Radway also found that her readers, women who did see themselves and describe themselves first and foremost as wives and mothers, used their books to erect a barrier between themselves and their families, however temporarily. Whether or not Radway's conclusions broadly apply then to romance readers beyond the small sample that she studied, I still find her conclusions intriguing, that for these women, not just the story itself, but the act of reading provided a temporary emotional satisfaction, allowing the women to return to their everyday lives of total self-giving with renewed energy and purpose. Radway's examination of these motives of some romance readers points both to a confirmation of and a possible challenge to the total mutuality envisioned in John Paul's spousal meaning of the body. We can't escape the fact that, according to John Paul, it is the husbands in the end who are responsible for ensuring their wives' sexual pleasure. I'll talk about that a little more in a bit. But as already noted, the readers Radway studied were persistent in defending and justifying the solitary pleasures of romance reading. Something that pleasured themselves alone was, in the end, they argued, good also for their families. I'll further take up this defense of solitary pleasure as ultimately good for the community shortly when I look at Gudorf. In the meanwhile, then, continuing to reflect on the links between romantic rhetoric and the theology of the body, there are ways in which it and Christopher West's popularization of it do not, after all, resemble the 70s Harlequin romance with a brutal hero treating the heroine badly because he loves her, like the fourth grade bully who really has a crush on you, so he pulls your hair, but instead resembles these newer romances in several ways as well. So back to you. West figures Pope John Paul II himself as, I think, akin to a new romance hero of these kind of novels that Radway was studying and her readers were reading. He is attentive to a nurturing of women's needs. Drawing on John Paul's pre-papacy experience as a counselor of married couples then, West is able to portray John Paul as the tender lover, like Christ, who does not scold, forbid, or condemn, but who rather just wants what's best for, especially, women, and who offers consolation to those who have a hard time obeying sexual teachings, emphasizing redemption over condemnation. West offers comfort to those who have succumbed to the secular counterfeits of authentic love, explaining that Christ showed compassion to sexual sinners, especially women, quoting West now, because behind their deception, he knew that they were looking for him, the true bridegroom. He imagines the reaction of the woman taken in adultery, the biblical story, to Christ telling her, when Christ tells her to go and sin no more, as follows. Did she, West wonders, grumble, who is this man to tell me what I can and cannot do with my body? Or, he continues, do you think, having encountered the love she was truly looking for, she left transformed, renewed, affirmed in the deepest part of her being as a woman? This is what Christ offers to us all. With very little editing, this could appear in almost any romance novel I've ever read as, a kind of culminating moment between the man and the woman. West portrays both Christ and Pope John Paul II as sensitive, albeit celibate, romance heroes who really understand what women want and counsels their fulfillment. West gets a lot of rhetorical mileage out of highlighting, for instance, John Paul's insistence in a book he wrote before assuming the papacy, Love and Responsibility, that the husband must assure his wife has an orgasm. Such tenderness on his part, says West, in the context of marital intercourse, acquires the significance of an act of virtue. West goes on to say that when he read this passage from Love and Responsibility during a lecture that he himself was giving, an astonished engaged woman exclaimed, "The Pope rocks." So I'm also finding it interesting that he had to point out that she was engaged. Like, I'm not sure it would have been okay if an unengaged woman had thought that it was cool that the Pope is saying husbands need to make sure their wives have an orgasm. So again, that's something to think about. So what if this attempt to recuperate sexual pleasure from its historic denigration in Christian tradition were taken even further? The strategy of revisionist ethics, as performed by theologians like Christine Gudorf, Mark Jordan, Patricia Beatty Young, just to name a few, is to recuperate pleasure not simply as an instrumental good pointing beyond itself to something larger, but as a good in its own right. I think this is a little bit where Radway's conclusions about the women are leading me to think, well, what is it about a defense of solitary pleasure? And yeah, I am going to go there in a minute. It might be crucial to rethinking ethics, sexual ethics. So I want to turn briefly to feminist theologian Christine Gudorf's defense of mutual sexual pleasure as a new norm that should shape, in her view, Christian sexual ethics. Immediately, Gudorf's bold and uncompromising 1994 work, Body, Sex, and Pleasure, Reconstructing Christian Sexual Ethics, throws down a gauntlet to the tradition, which has problematically linked redemption with sex for both men and women, but especially for women. She writes, women are saved either by the exercise of their reproductive function in the tradition or by following the path of discipleship laid out by Jesus for men and women alike. These are clearly two very different claims in Gudorf's view. She advocates setting aside Christian sexual tradition as the starting place for reflection on sexual ethics because she finds the contrast between these claims so stark. As does Mark Jordan, Gudorf finds that piecemeal tinkering and revision will not do. It is the basic principles of paradigms of Christian theological tradition that need revision, in her view. And I've just listed for you, I won't read aloud, the basic teachings of Christian sexual morality that she feels need to go. So this is where she starts. She takes on traditional natural law arguments as well, in the way that they root sexual complementarity in biblical interpretation when she asserts that, for instance, as a kind of obvious counter-argument, if the placement of the clitoris in the female body reflects the divine will, then God wills that sex is not just oriented to procreation, but is at least as, if not more, oriented to pleasure. Our society's problem, Gudorf notes, actually sounding rather like West here, which I think is interesting. If our problem is the undervaluing and not the overvaluing of sexual pleasure, Gudorf wants to put it right back front and center of her ethical program. She diagnoses our real problem as a lack of connection, the lack of feeling another person as one's neighbor. And she finds that this distance in our modern society is exacerbated and not remedied by asceticism and self-denial. She argues that a norm of mutual sexual pleasure is necessary to foster better community, overturning the common perception, or perhaps misperception, that love of self is antithetical to love of neighbor. Pleasuring oneself, as Gudorf suggests in her defense of masturbation as a pre-moral good, may be a precursor to being able to give pleasure to another, whether sexually or in any other way. And I'll just leave you again with another long quote, which is kind of, in brief, her program for revamping Christian sexual ethics. So I find this interesting to put next to West's claim that if we only got sex right, everything else would fall into place, that the doctrine of the theology of the body suggests that the spousal meaning of the body is the key to interpreting all of Christian theology. And in a kind of, I think Gudorf kind of makes a similar claim, right? If we only get sex right, then somehow everything else falls into place. I'm not sure that I agree with either of them about that, but I find it intriguing that they're both making that claim from very different stances in relation to the being critical to the tradition. So it is too easy, I think, to relegate arguments such as Gudorf's to a kind of sexual revolutionary generation, and to claim that the concerns that she and others like her address are no longer of concern to a new generation. So I don't want to maybe go quite as far to say that obviously West appeals to young people, and obviously Gudorf is going to appeal to the baby boomers and the people who sort of grew up before Vatican II. I think there's a lot more complexity there. And to just kind of give an example of this, conspicuously absent, for instance, from West's Theology of the Body for Beginners, though I think he does discuss it elsewhere, is any substantial discussion of homosexuality. It's like this isn't even a concern that younger people might have for any reason. So I want to conclude then with some thoughts about the larger context of magisterial teachings on sexuality against which the theology of the body is able to appear in stark relief as a corrective which celebrates the goodness of the body and of sexual pleasure. I suggest that John Paul II's theology of the body needs the romantic popularization of Christopher West, or someone very like him, if not him. As Luke Timothy Johnson notes, the prose of the former Pope's original catecheses are not only dense and difficult to read, but mind-numbingly repetitious. He claims that the Pope only asserts and never demonstrates, and minimizes the flat internal contradictions among the different catecheses. While Johnson goes on to note, perhaps rather wistfully, that these are minor deficiencies, since how many theological writings are not dense, repetitious, and inconsistent, which I think is kind of a sad thing for Catholic tradition if it's true. Mark Jordan, on the other hand, points out that the stylistic deficiencies of papal documents are not merely unfortunate infelicities of prose to be shrugged off in the interest of getting to the actual message, but that they are rhetorical devices central to the message being delivered. He argues, for instance, that tedium, repetition, invocation of absolute authorities, and even violent threats do work in official Catholic teachings on homosexuality. We can read documents like the Theology of the Body, then, as the kinder, gentler side of such prohibitions. And this is exactly how I think West portrays the theology of the body. He writes, "The Pope doesn't need to, nor does he attempt to force assent to his proposals. The Pope imposes nothing and wags a finger at no one," end quote. He doesn't have to. That work is accomplished elsewhere. But at the same time, as Gudorf points out, it is difficult not to suspect that the reason for hanging on to sexual complementarity is that, together with the principle that every sexual act must be open to procreation, it constitutes the moral bulwark against homosexuality. If those drop out of the tradition, there's very little left to support a prohibition of homosexual sexual activity. If Theology of the Body retains much of the authoritative style of John Paul II's predecessors, even in this kinder, gentler guise, in proffering a new rethinking of the importance of sexuality to the Catholic faith, what we might say sort of stereotypically is a masculine kind of rhetoric, thou shalt not, West complements this style with his more personal, anecdotal, and confessional style, which perhaps in implicitly utilizing those cultural conventions of authenticity and experience found in romance novels, appeals more to women, the overwhelming audience for romance fiction. West gets readers more quickly than John Paul II to the expected ending: don't have sex except for non-contracepted, procreative heterosexual sex within marriage, but perhaps offers a more pleasurable way of getting there, in which the rewards of obedience include the heightened feeling of communal solidarity as we all await a promised consummation of romance in heaven. Furthermore, a celibate romance hero like John Paul II might appeal quite a bit to those for whom, as noted above, real romance is about talking, just talking. If it is true that college-age young adults, especially women, don't actually have many, if at all, positive experiences of sex, and I'm willing to keep that question open, Fridas leads us there, but then Gudorf's message that experience should inform theology is indeed a message that may fall on deaf ears, kind of drawing from her long quote. Conversely, their negative experiences may indeed make them more receptive to the interpretation offered by Christopher West, that these bad experiences are merely steps along the way, pointing them to the true experiences that they are supposed to be having. The rhetorical achievement of the theology of the body may be in reconnecting romance and sex for those for whom it has been practically, but not ideally, severed. Thanks.